Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Erica Knuckles. I'm the Director of Learning, Engagement, and Partnerships here at the Westmoreland Museum of American Art. And we have a tradition that we're now following. I'd like to start with a moment of acknowledgments before we get to our program. The Westmoreland Museum of American Art is situated upon the traditional lands of the Adena, Hopewell, Monongahela, Osage, Delaware, Shawnee, and Seneca Cayuga peoples. We honor all of the indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built this country during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the indigenous communities and people of color across the country, which guides and inspires our work as a museum. And now we will get our program started, our In Conversation Curator Talk with Melissa Wolfe and Barbara Jones.
Thanks, Erica. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. It's one of those beautiful dark nights out there, fall in Pennsylvania. So this exhibition was initially going to be organized by Melissa when she was the Curator of American Art at the Columbus Museum of Art. When she took a new job at the St. Louis Art Museum, Dee Dee Wigmore, who's Dee Wigmore Fine Art in New York, she handles the estate of Doris Lee. She approached us and asked if we would be interested in organizing it, and of course we jumped at that opportunity. We love Doris Lee, we have 2 paintings of hers in our collection, and so it was a really great opportunity. But Melissa was really generous in sharing her research materials, and there were boxes and boxes of them that she shared with me over Dropbox. But I thought she should be part of this exhibition. I think she was willing to just turn it over to me, and I thought she'd done so much work. She's so knowledgeable about it. I wanted her to be the co-curator, and so she agreed. So this is where we are today. But that was in 2017. Melissa wrote the main essay for the catalog, which, sorry, I'm going to drop my paper, which I did. Catalog here, available in the museum shop, our shameless plug for that. But she wrote the main essay for the catalog. I wrote the chapter on commercial art, and then we had 2 additional art historians as authors, John Fagg and Tom Wolfe. Our team here at the Westmoreland took on the logistics of the exhibition, the loans, which are 75 works, from 59 lenders from 25 states. So it was pretty amazing gathering all these works together. And so many of them are from private collectors. They're works that you wouldn't have the opportunity necessarily to see in public. But we also handled the catalog production, the shipping arrangements, and then securing 3 additional venues for her work to reach more people. Melissa and I and my assistant worked on the gallery layout together via Zoom. Thank goodness for Zoom during COVID, and emails went back and forth. But this exhibition was supposed to open in 2020 in conjunction with the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, but COVID, of course, put the brakes on that. So we're really happy right now that it's here, and I have to say it's turned out better than I could have expected it to be. It is the first large-scale exhibition of Doris Lee's complete body of work, her fine and commercial art together, and we're proud to share her work with our audience, you, all of the others out there in video land, and also with our new audience that's going to be in Davenport, Iowa soon, and opening there in February, and then Vero Beach, Florida, and Memphis, Tennessee. So when I first met Melissa, she'd been working on Doris for over 10 years. Now that over 10 years is probably over 20 years now. So my first question for you is, what first drew you to Doris in the first place, and what do you find interesting specifically about her work?
Well, just quickly, first of all, Barbara just went over the administration of the catalog and the loans and procuring venues, and that is so hard. It's just not an easy thing. It is so much work that you just don't even realize it is. Cajoling people and changing schedules because some crazy person decides they want something else, and then it is not an easy thing. And Barbara and everyone here did an absolutely amazing job. I mean, it's such a workload to take that on and to tour it and to do a catalog with it, and the number of lenders. It's a show that, a museum like St. Louis, it would be considered a difficult, a big undertaking, even for a show, an institution that has, many more staff. So it's a big thing. It's a big thing. You should be really, really proud and think, think pretty highly of all that. So, so Doris Lee, yes. Okay, so
that's why we're here. That's why we're here. Erica's going to do it for you.
Okay, so let's go. So I counted back, and I first ran into Doris Lee in 1999, which is 22 years ago. I was at the Butler Institute in Youngstown, Ohio, and they had a donor who was interested in buying something, and Dee Dee Wigmore sent this out, and I fell in love with it. The Butler just ended up not getting it, which then I thought, then I'll get it somewhere else. But I didn't. It's in a private collection. But I just was so charmed by it. It just, and sometimes it just makes me happy. And that's an okay thing. But it also makes me happy as an art historian, right? It's so simple, and yet it's incredibly sophisticated. It's charming, it's not saccharine, it's not sentimental. When you look at it, it holds your attention for a long time. So it not only made me happy as a person who couldn't we use some nice things in the world, but also as a trained art historian. So Doris sort of went on. I moved from the Butler. There were many years that passed. And then I became interested in, as my career continued and I did some shows on other women artists and other American scene artists working in the 30s, I became very interested in how those artists negotiated the rise of abstraction. And many of them worked in abstraction, so it's not just abstraction. It's the rise in the 40s, post-war, and into the 50s, where abstraction, there was no other serious painting other than abstraction, or non-objective painting, even more specifically. And so, you'd had non-objective painting for half a century. But it was this change that there wasn't lots of different ways of creating serious or important art, that was the only way. And so I was very interested in how did these American scene artists, these figurative storytelling artists, how did they manage that? And some, sort of got overwhelmed, but these are good artists. And they didn't just sort of lose themselves, as the story goes, that celebrates abstract expressionism or the New York School. All artists of whom I love as well, right? I'm not on a grumpy kick. But they were good artists, so how did they do that? So I started looking at artists who I thought did that well, and I came back to Doris, because I think she does it remarkably well, both in terms of keeping a sense of who she is, looking at the artwork, pulling in things, but keeping a sense of who she is and yet not becoming stagnant. And I thought she did it well in terms of the market. She was incredibly successful, both in commercial work, which Barbara will talk about, but also in fine art, in sort of anything she put her hand into. And so she sort of became my exemplar for thinking about how this happened, and particularly for women artists. So that's my sort of interest and why I continued. So my question then became, which turned into this show, was how and why did she do this? Like, how did she do it, right? Why did she do it, and how did she keep her vision, right? How did she negotiate this really difficult world? And so I thought, her work is just a really powerful, it's deceptive because it seems really easy, but it's a really powerful mix of her being just incredibly attentive to the lived experience, her physical world, and attentive to the visual world, to her contemporaries, to contemporary art history, to past art history, and it's this really powerful mix. So first of all, I think one of the things that people realize right off the bat is folk art. So we've got to click. You don't have to look at that one forever. So Doris worked in Woodstock. There was a huge community of people who collected folk art. Doris did as well, and you see her over there when she's very young. She had first moved to Woodstock, and she's got a folk art painting, a couple above her, but you see all the things, she's so taken by objects that she collects. And so this is one of her works. She does a series of important women. She does Gertrude Stein, she does the Bronte sisters, number of different famous women series. But she does them clearly in this folk art style, very flat, decorative. Doris is an incredible designer. Her eye for design, right, for two-dimensional design, composition in that sense is just unmatched. I mean, it's really wonderful. So folk art, and then the next slide. And also in something like this. So, and she knew folk art very, very well. She knew Abby Rockefeller. She knew her collection very well that became Colonial Williamsburg. So she was in that mix. So this is a work that came out of Abby Rockefeller's collection, and I compare it to a Doris Lee just to show you the sort of tilted angle, you know, the little bridge that comes over the stream, and also the railroad track in the Pickett painting, the linearity of the trees up along the top and the figures and everything in Doris's, but the simple mountains that go up, the way things are kind of overlap, but not really, so you can see everything, right? Nothing's hiding in there or anything, and sort of the charm of it, but the detail and the linearity. So she's clearly looking at folk art. She's also, my next slide, she's also coming out of American scene, right? I said, what do these American scene artists do? So she's really grounded in American scene. That's when she hits the big stage. That's, where she really finds how she wants to paint. And so I just do a comparison of an early work, Illinois River Town, with John Stuart Curry's Baptism in Kansas. So it's everyday scenes, everyday people moving out of, the art centers of New York, the urban areas, moving back to where you're, the world in which you grew up or that you knew, your hometown, the people that you know, and painting those kinds of scenes. So it's genre, it's narrative, storytelling. I suppose, but it's storytelling. And that's really sort of at the heart of, she really finds herself in that. Then the next slide is Cubism. When she went to Paris, she studied under André Lotte, who was, he's mostly known for teaching, but he was a Cubist. And many Americans who studied Cubism in Europe and came back, particularly the ones in Woodstock, simplify Cubism. It's more of a synthetic Cubism than an analytic Cubism, but all the planes and everything are much more simplified. The angles, the lines are cleaner, but you still have her storytelling, you still have the charm of folk art, but what you've now got is that, so it's a family building a house, and she and Arnold, her partner, built a house a year after she painted this, so they were thinking about it, they designed it. But what you see is, the base of the house or whatever actually has a reverse perspective, right? Normally it would go smaller in the back, and that kind of flips it up in an odd way, right? And also the stream going across the front with the boards over them kind of flips up. It looks like it's flat, right, as opposed to going back into space. But yet then there's people on that foundation, right? And so that kind of pushes it back into space. So it's that classic Cubist tension between flipping up, I always think of it as like a springboard and then getting pushed back, right? That kind of tension is sort of at the heart of Cubism. And then she also, and I didn't put a slide in this, but she believed that any kind of visual creation, of creative creation, was on par, was equal with anything else. She did not see a difference between calligraphy and fine art painting, between illustration and fine art. I mean, none of that. She all saw it as the same. It took the same level of creativity and thinking and sophistication. So she draws, when I went through all of her papers, like her, artists always collect images, right? She collected calligraphy. She collected children's books. She collected cartoons, like Mickey Mouse cartoons. And everything was sort of fodder for her and equal. And you see this all pulled together, I think, and I picked a painting here, Fox and Geese, a slide. So, of course, the charm of folk art, and you notice how nothing overlaps, really, like the snowman and the two houses, and the one house comes right between the trees, like trees don't go over it, right? And they're playing fox and geese, so again, sort of a storytelling, right? I don't know if you guys played fox and geese, but I certainly did growing up. And the children, sort of this simplicity and charm, and yet there's also this cubist sophistication, right? So that the fox and geese, it's flat, it goes back into space, and the children are running on it. But when you actually look at it, it starts to look like it's flat, like a little pizza round, right? And the little kid on the top sort of starts to look like he's on top of a wheel, right? And then that tree pushes it back. And so it's this really sophisticated sense of cubism that's at the heart of what she's doing here. So a really wonderful sense of abstraction, charm, storytelling, pulling from everything around her. So I think that's why, in one way, that's what I like about her, is this incredible, powerful mix. So that's my answer.
Good answer. So her style changes, as most artists do, but in the exhibition upstairs, I think, has everybody seen the exhibition? So it seems rather abrupt, and as I've been giving tours, people have been asking me about that. It seems like, why did her style change so abruptly? Well, we know that it really didn't. If we could fill in the, other 40 works that are in between where it breaks up there, you would see that it was a little bit, more subtle, the change. But you'll also see that she goes back and forth stylistically. So I wanted Melissa to talk a little bit more about that, about her style changes.
Yeah, and she does change her style. I would say there's sort of three, sort of American scene very early, and then 40s and 50s when it's like this, like Fox and Geese, more linear, flat, more decorative line. She's paying more attention to line, and then a late style. And actually, you can change there. So I should have done that, right? So an early style, a middle style, and then a late style where she's, she is such a colorist. She is so amazing. And I'm sure Barbara came across it. Her middle and later paintings are very hard to reproduce to get the colors right because they're just so, they're so subtle. The palette is so subtle. It's hard for a copy to get that. And so this later, more abstract, more using color to be more evocative as opposed to line or two-dimensional design. But in fact, and I put a quote up at the very top that's in the catalog, and it's Doris herself. So she addresses this issue of style, and she says, I don't think the content of an artist's work changes much, even though the means or style changes drastically. So what does she mean by that? Because what I'm talking about when I say I think she's a coherent artist, her oeuvre makes sense, it's consistent, she has her own vision, I'm in some sense talking about content. And content for her does not change. Style, I think she would say, changes in order to facilitate the content. So content to her is what an artist wants to say. What does an artist think is important to say? What are they trying to get all that style and changing it around to get even better and better, to get clearer, to get more immediate, whatever, right? What is that artist's goal? What's important to them? And so I thought about that when Barbara and I were talking about this. And I think, so if we think of style as her apparatus to get at her content, what is her content? I thought about that, because actually, of course, I think I've thought about Doris Lee for 22 years. But Barbara asking me that and saying, people were, thinking about style and content made me think, succinctly, what is it? And I would say that it is, she wants to get at being alive, the lived experience, that moment when you are living, when you're not on your phone watching living, right? Or when you're not aware that other people are watching you, but when you are absorbed in being alive. When it's about a sensory experience, it might be about a memory, being sort of pulled into a memory. It might be a bodily experience, right? A physical experience. But I think her whole point is to get at those experiences better and better and to convey that to the viewer. So we can take a look a little bit. And so what I want to do is kind of look at some of the styles that she's picking up on, she's often been, seen as, well, not really derogatory, but, there's a lot of comparison of her and Milton Avery and Sally Michael because they painted together. Of course, it's always the man who's, influencing the women. And I don't think that was the case. I think it was a dialogue between them. But I just thought, let's take a few moments and look at content and style and think about that, about what's consistent and what is changing and why. She's very intentional in her change. So let's go to the next slide. So early, this is the widow, and it's very American scene, right? I mean, it's a widow, she's trying to tame horses, a team has gotten away. So it's story, but it's not. When you look at this woman, I mean, she's got muscles and she's pulling them together, and you know what it makes me think of? My next slide. Oh, nope. Oh no, did it not do this? Oh, well, anyway, I'm gonna come up to that. I'm so sorry, that's coming. So she talks about a violence, and it'll come up this next one. She says, I feel a kind of violence. When someone asked her early on, and she didn't mean like violence, but she meant like this woman, right? Pulling things in, and that's this being engrossed in a bodily thing, right? Being engrossed in like wanting something so bad, like when your lived experience is kind of overwhelming you. I think that's what she meant. And it's sort of the state of this woman, but we'll come back to her. So the next slide, or this slide, which for me, this painting, is so evocative of night, right? Of, how the sounds are sort of muffled at night and the air is sort of cool and you sort of see a moonlight flicker, but you don't really see the leaves or whatever. You sort of see those things down on the ground. They might be birds, it might be moonlight, but the glow of the trees, the way sometimes leaves, those waxy leaves might reflect. And it is this moment, right? You feel her sitting, this is her back porch, this is her patio, looking out over her backyard. But it's so magical. It could be anyone's, right? I mean, it really pulls you into this very lived experience, her being so attuned to this moment and trying to figure out how to convey that. And so it's this color, it's the little dots, she's shifted her, her style to get at what she wants to say, to get at this experience. Or this next slide. So here she is, and what I said, I told you it was on her patio, and so do you see those little sculpture down on the bottom right-hand corner? Those are sculptures by William Edmondson, who was a folk artist from Nashville, Tennessee, and she and Arnold collected him very, very early on, and those are her pieces. And so this is actually her back patio, right? Those are things that she owns. Those are folk art pieces. And in fact, one of her interests in folk art was how immediate it was. William Edmondson, chipping out on the stone, right? Like hammering it and chipping it, and you still see the marks on it. You still see his action on it, right? And there was this immediacy to it that a lot of trained artists were really drawn to. And so I feel like there's this kind of immediate, rawness to this evening scene. Okay, the next, she's having a party too. Who doesn't like a party? And here I show you two very different styles, right? So the Grapefruit still life, which is one of my very favorites, very influenced by folk art, by these little lines, sort of these large forms, very frontal, very formal and sort of symmetrical. And then a later work, this Sunset in the Florida Keys. And so you might think, okay, so that's a very different piece. You might start thinking of Gottlieb, or Gottlieb was working in Woodstock at this time, with the red sort of sun setting. But in fact, I see these two as moments when, if you sit in front of them, go upstairs and do it. I feel like, and I do this, I just sit in front of a painting for, a half an hour or whatever. I used to make my students sit in front of a painting, or sit in front of a work of art for 5 minutes and not write anything, don't take any notes, don't do anything, just sit for 5 minutes and think about it and let it do its thing. And actually, I could get them to do that because I would say, look, if you're listening to a popular song and you listen to 5 seconds of it, would you really know if you liked it or not? No. I'd say, well, okay, why don't you give a painting 4.5 minutes, or however long a song is, to decide if you like it or not, and do the same thing with this. But it's about slowing down, right? Don't both of these sort of make you settle in? And I feel like they both sort of, there's a solitude about them, there's a solidity, a kind of silence. I feel like you have to be comfortable to sit with these for a long time. You have to be comfortable being by yourself, and you have to be sort of comfortable with silence, right? With that calm and sort of equilibrium. And that's, so that's her content, is this lived experience, and it's in both of these. She's just changing her style to get at what she feels in that moment, right? But it's the same content. Okay, the next slide. And something like this. And as I said, she's not just looking at art history, and we'll look at that in a minute, but she's also looking at the artists around her. She's not derivative. She's not, but she is thinking about color. She is a colorist from day one. And it becomes more and more part of her palette because she sees even more the expressive power of it. Someone like Rothko. And she's still herself. Like, I would still know this as a Doris Lee. It's a pasture, it's cows, it's, I don't know if those are cottonwoods or aspens or something, but right? But it's also this fabulous gold color that just shines, right? And I feel sort of like you can get lost in it in the same way you do with a Rothko. If you just sit in front of a Rothko and you start to see the layers and the veils, so to speak, of the different colors that he's put washes on, right? And I think with Lee's work, it's kind of the same way. You start to see the mottled tones in that gold, or the mottled tones in other of her late color. And she's doing this intentionally. She's putting slightly different colors next to each other, and then they kind of vibrate a little bit, right? So she's looking around her, but not losing her voice. And then the next slide. Oranges and avocados. So I told you about Milton Avery and Sally Michael. And I think they are coming together thinking about reducing what it is on the canvas. So she starts, if you think Grapefruit, Still Life, that Grapefruit Still Life, that's a reductive canvas, right? I mean, she's simplified that way down as well. So she's gone even more with your guys's, oranges and avocados, and you see this dialogue with Milton Avery. You see her cutting down that, it's a table, right? And then there's something behind it, but it also reads, again, as flat, right? She's again doing this dimension, but flat, but she's simplified it even more in the way that Milton Avery has as well. His painting reads as 3 bands, but yet you also read it as shore, water, and sky, right? But there's nothing in it that indicates going back into space. There's nothing in Doris Lee's background. It's just a flat color. It's this color. They are using color to pure color, in essence, to create the illusion, to create the scene that you're seeing. And you still know that those are avocados and oranges, right? I mean, and there's a charm to it, but I love these strong horizontals and this reduced palette. And then the next slide. And I think you see it as well with someone like Sally Michael, where, again, it's just the colors in Sally Michael's composition that lets you know those are different trees, and also gives you a sense of moving back into space. That blue that's at the bottom right corner is just a flat blue, but you sort of read it as going back, don't you? But it's just about the color. It's about that blue being being next to that green. The same thing with Doris Lee's Earth and Sky. I think this is her outdoing Milton Avery, actually, where you just have these simple squares, this band of rectangles, right? And then these simple shapes up in the sky, and yet we read a farmland, don't we? I grew up in farmland. I smell earth. I smell black dirt. But it's still narrative, it's still storytelling. It's still the simplified forms of folk art. But she's also looking at the world around her, the art world around her, and she's digesting it. She's thinking about it, and then when she produces it, it's her own thing by the time she produces it. Okay, the next one. And so here's what I was talking to you about with the widow, right? We normally think of men struggling with demons, and it is the men's struggle that can be universal, right? It's struggle against goodness and evil. It's, it's always men who get to do that, right? I mean, too bad for Laocoon. It's men who have to fight with serpents. But she puts women in that place all the time. And I would say if there was something else that is continual through her, that is her content, is looking at the world as a woman, as an artist embodied in a woman's body, and relating to the world in that way, and thinking about that. Sometimes she's very subtle, but I mean, to this, she's challenging. I know she knows she's doing it. She had a card of Laocoon. She has a card of a bunch of things like this in her files. And then the next slide, she also had an image of this in her slides. And I think she's looking on these goddesses, right, who were to be feared. Think of Medusa or the snake goddess, right? And I think she's drawing on those, the Minoan. She had tons of cards from Minoan culture. And I think she's putting these kinds of universal big ideas that are usually put in a male body in a female body. The next slide. Again, here, she's tongue-in-cheek. She knows very well what she's doing. So she was often, in her day, seen as kind of like the female Grant Wood. And she knew Grant Wood quite well. But here you see, Grant Wood with his figures and the woman, that was actually supposed to be the farmer's daughter. Everybody just decided it was his wife, so Wood went along with it. But it's supposed to be a spinster daughter, right? And the dad, not letting anyone near. But what I find interesting in Doris Lee is the woman introduces us to the estate. That's always the men's job, right? But it's the woman who introduces us to this tidy estate, not the woman who's standing behind looking sideways, worried because there's her dad standing in front of her. And I think one of the reasons why I think this is a quote is take a look at Doris's house and the linear decoration on it, how she does the pattern, and then take a look at Grant Wood's house. She's kind of mimicking him, and very intentionally. But I also love the modernism in Doris's. There's a quote that she starts out with Grandma Moses and ends up, who's the next artist that they say, in modernism or well into modernism. And you look at those, you miss it at first, but those back mountains are outlined. They're abstracted, right? They're not filled out, and yet we sort of pass over that because it works together so well. The next slide. And then this work, Art Students League, if you think about it, she's looking very carefully at this. This is not, what's on the canvas is the female nude, and what is one of the high points of Western art is the female nude, right? As a topic, as a grand topic. And she cuts it down, man, she just tears it apart. So you've got the female nude on the painting, right? But then you have the model. And all of the things she needs to be, this is her job. She's shown as a job. There's the clock, there's the screen that she dresses and undresses behind. She's sitting there, she's got her legs crossed, she's still, she's on that platform, in art classes. She's working. I mean, it's a job. She just takes that grand nude and just pulls it right down to a real female having to work. And you know who you connect to? Is it the painting or the real female? It's the real female. And in fact, let's do another slide. I mean, I think she is very intentionally, tweaking a little bit someone like Titian and these female nudes that were for a male gaze. I don't know if you are familiar with that phrase or not, but female nudes were almost always meant to be looked at as a male. They weren't necessarily meant to be looked at from a male's perspective, right? Whereas in Doris Lee's, it's very much a female's perspective. She's all business, right? She's doing her job. She's, it's a very matter-of-fact thing. And it's in some sense, the scene is made for a female looking at it. The next slide. And I think this is true here as well. So the dream. So this woman her eyes aren't closed. They're kind of drowsy. She's nude, right? But she's not turned towards us. She doesn't have her head turned like Venus of Urbino, right? Kind of, flirting. She's in her own world. And what's above her is this horse that seems to have appeared, right? In this red over this intense blue. And so you might think of who? You want next slide? Matisse. And I think she's doing this completely intentionally. So Matisse, these exoticized female nudes who are looking out and posing, that's supposed to be a male looking at her, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just figured as a male looking at her. Whereas when you look at the two of them now with Doris's woman is in her own world. She's got, I don't know what's going on in her head, but it's not who's looking at her. And the horse that's sort of, appeared over her. But I think in being so clearly related to something, like when you look at the Art Students League, I think immediately of the female nude because of the painting there. When I look at this, I think Matisse. Those are Matisse colors. That outline, that red, that blue, and I think she's doing that intentionally. She's not derivative of Matisse. She's quoting him and twisting him, right? And I think that's something she does from the very beginning with her widow to the very last painting she does. I think she is very adamant that she look at things from her body, from her world and her space. And so I think that's also something that sort of continues throughout her career that I think you could see. So I hope that made sense. So she does change her style. She goes back and forth with different styles. She doesn't change her interests. She doesn't change her content or what she thinks is important to convey. And I think it's this attention to being alive. It's an attention to our sensory and our body and our relationship and the smells and the things around us. Anyway, so there's that. And then Barbara.
So so you already went through my next question about her dialogue with other artists. So that's good. You've already gone through that. So the next slide yes. So here we are. So we'll go through these very quickly. But this is the first exhibition where you're going to be able to see Doris's commercial work as well as her fine art. So I want to show you some of the commissions that she did. So the painting that you're seeing, the credits aren't showing up for some reason, but anyway, it's off to auction, and Doris was one of 19 artists that was commissioned by the American Tobacco Company to show the production of tobacco and how it made it from its growing all the way to the cigarette package. So of the 19 artists, Doris was the only woman, and so this is the New Yorker advertisement that the painting that is at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art was used for. So this painting was commissioned specifically by the American Tobacco Company, and that is how it was used. And you could have seen it in Life magazine as well. Next, Erica. And she also did this painting, Harvest Time, that's from the Smithsonian American Art Museum for A Beer Belongs advertisement for the U.S. Brewers Association. And I have to put my glasses on to read this, but one of my docents pointed this out, and I think it's really interesting. It says, it's the beverage of moderation. So, beer is still obviously very popular. So, next, please. And I just thought this was really fabulous. When I was going through Doris's files, I came across a number of her illustrations for Abbott Laboratories, and she did these illustrations for their quarterly magazine, What's New. And this is illustrations that for Duazine Dulcet tablets were basically phenobarbital. And so when a child is lost, you see this child lost in this crowd, and when she's at the police station, the policeman's offering her a lollipop, which is this phenobarbital lollipop, which would then relax this child, and so she wouldn't be so afraid. So there's a number of these illustrations, including one of Georgia pralines that were just in candy form. So really so unusual, I think. But as Melissa was saying, Doris didn't see a difference. She didn't really think about this line between commercial art and fine art, and she did these illustrations, still, very flat, very colorful, very almost folk art-like for these works as well. So next one, please. Her lithographs were used as transfers for stoneware, and this one, Afternoon Train or Winter Train, it was transferred to this plate of Stoneland pottery. And Associated American Artists was really her major promoter, and she was represented by a number of other really important galleries in New York, but AAA was the gallery that really took advantage, I think, and promoted these artists and offered them all these commercial opportunities. So prints that were sold on commission, and then the Stoneland pottery line. Next, please. She illustrated the Rodgers and Hart Songbook, the cover, which is the jacket you see there, and then the painting with a song in my heart is one of the illustrations on page 86 of the Songbook, and then a painting that came from it that was actually inspired by it but not reproduced. But she did 80 illustrations in this book, including all the illustrations for the song lyric pages. Next. Fabric design for Riverdale Fabrics in 1952. We have 2 colorways upstairs, one made in curtains, which is really great, the cream color, and then we also have the gray. But it obviously came in yellow, the gray, and actually on eBay we found a green version, but I was not able to buy it. I tried, but I didn't get it. Next, please. And she illustrated for Mademoiselle magazine. She illustrated for a lot of magazines, 17, Saturday Evening Post, Life magazine, but this is for Pauline Tregere's Forecasts. And so she was interested in fashion. There's a whole fashion line that the illustrations that she did for different magazines. And next, please. So her lithographs for AAA were after her paintings, and so the helicopter, afternoon tea, apple pickers, and blossom time. So different times from the 30s through the 50s, where she was able to create these prints after her paintings. And they were sold on subscription from AAA, and those were sold for $5. So they could really make it into anybody's home, so could have their own original work of art. Next. And everything else that she did, I mean, she was such an entrepreneur in this way. She was such a businesswoman. Picture puzzle, we have the painting, dance rehearsal in the exhibition, as well as the puzzle, playing cards. She illustrated The Great Quillo by James Thurber, and there's Hunter the Giant eating a full-size pig. He's got it in his fingers. And the Fred Harvey restaurants, she illustrated the menus for them. And this particular one that we have in the exhibition is from St. Louis. So, next. And the catalog, of course, I showed you already, but here it is, available in the museum shop. And we really love putting this catalog together, and we just feel like it's a real tribute to Doris. And so we hope you will buy it and enjoy reading it as well. So, and one thing Melissa didn't say about this painting called The View, Woodstock, is that, yes, we're being introduced by a woman, and there is the man taking a nap in the back. She's doing all the work, and he's napping on the porch. So
I didn't want to come down on him too bad.
I know. I can't. I have to be heartless that way. So I'd like to just open it up to questions to the audience, and Erica will field them with the microphone, because we are being videotaped, just so you know. This will be available on YouTube next week on our YouTube channel, so we can reach an even larger audience with this lecture as well.
Any questions?
This may seem a stretch, but in her interest in combining the commercial, or addressing the commercial and eliminating that line between fine art and commercial, can you draw any comparisons with Andy Warhol?
We knew that.
You want to do it?
Yeah.
You know, that's funny. Barbara and I were talking about just that, and Andy Warhol came up. And, you know, he started in commercial work and then switched over to fine art. But of course, it definitely influenced the artwork that he was creating, and his interest. I mean, if you wanted to think of his content, it's the interest of mass media, of mass production, and what that means, right? And a very sophisticated thinking of what that means. It's not just Campbell soup cans, right? I mean, it's actually how it is, in some sense, how it is that reproduction the more something is reproduced, the less real it is, and the less real the thing behind it is. You know, the things that he does when they become less and less clear. It's sort of a take on that. I mean, does lots of other things too, but yes, and he did those, you know, together. He was successful in both, and I think she is like that. She continues the commercial art because she really, and I didn't think Warhol did, but does he? Does he continue his commercial work? I thought he sort of started that way and then moves on. And she keeps it, but you know, there's, you know, because many of these 30s artists, these American scene artists, did go into commercial work, but their commercial work looks completely different from their, you know, quote unquote fine art. And hers is just all one, it's all one vision. And in some sense, his is a little bit too, I think, in the content behind it, yeah. Did you want to say?
No, I'm good. That's good. I agree completely. Yeah, we were just talking about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both for the exhibition and the catalog, which I do have, so thank you. I love the images showing how she subverted the male gaze. Would you describe her as a feminist?
Well, Barbara actually probably has thoughts on this too, but she never used that word, but what she would say is that, I'm going to get this quote all wrong, so read the catalog because I quote it in the catalog. But she says a woman should feel natural in herself. She should feel natural with the sex that she is, right? That she should feel comfortable in that and in essence, you know, do her own thing, you know. And she gives a lecture, she gives it a couple of times, I think, but one of the times she gives it is at a conference at the University of Hawaii. And she talks about how women's work and men's work, you know, she read a lot of anthropology. Her degree as an undergraduate was in philosophy. And she talks a lot about how, for instance, Margaret Mead, everyone was reading Margaret Mead in the 50s, right? But she says how, you know, what Mead found is that in certain cultures, the things that we think are women's work, right, and so less important, is flipped in these other cultures. And she uses that as an example to say it's ridiculous to think that something is right just because it's been done, right, or that it's normal or it's the right way or something just because it's been done. And she talks about you know, that there are few women, or because women have been raised, and she actually calls it a really stupid way, she uses the word, in that, you know, you're supposed to find a husband and do work and whatever. So she does address it directly. I don't know that she ever addresses the feminist movement directly, but she definitely, you know, I mean, even if she never addressed that topic directly, she definitely was. I mean, do you find that as well?
I think that's true, and I think she was independent. You know, she was married to Russell Lee early. They divorced. She got together with Arnold, and she retained her independence. You know, and I think that shows in the work. And you know, as much as she didn't state it, it's there that she believed strongly in women and you know, as women as strong individuals.
Really enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much. We happened to see an Alex Katz exhibit in the Cleveland Art Museum a couple of years ago. I couldn't help but notice when I walked into the gallery upstairs so many similarities in color and flatness and folk art, and they had to have been contemporaries. So I'm just wondering if you know if they knew each other, if they just are two of many folk art artists out there, or if there was ever any awareness of each other's works.
I don't know who.
Alex Katz?
Oh, Alex Katz.
I don't know. I don't think I ever came across a mention. I mean, she does talk about certain artists, or we have pictures of her with, you know, artists. That's never come up. But I would be very surprised if she didn't know of his work, and that they were both coming to their work and this reduction of color and out of the same milieu, right? That they're the direction of their canvases, of their work, is a shared direction. But I would be very surprised if she didn't know him. I mean, she was still showing in New York. They went into New York to see shows all the time. So I would assume she knew him, but I don't know if she knew him personally. Yeah.
Yeah, and Alex could have found his way to Woodstock, too. I don't know that much about Alex Katz's work, but just looking at it, I mean, you think about, the relationships that he had in the color and the, Matisse. I mean, looking at Matisse. So yeah, and she and Doris, really did keep up with everything that was going on in the art world. So, and her reference material, as Melissa said, was voluminous. I mean, she had boxes and boxes of postcards of shows she went to, of, reference material, newspaper articles, she was so in tune with what was going on, in the art world.
And I would say that, Alex Katz and Doris Lee.
Leslie, yeah, take that. Yeah.
That another similarity would be this going back and forth with nature. Alex Katz has this beautiful studio in Maine, and he spent all this time in Skowhegan, and but then he still does it today, even he's really late in his career at this point, where he'll go back into like social commentary and then nature, but everything he does, even the nature, like Doris does, has a context, a very strong context, and ideology behind it. It's not just a tree.
Right. Michael, did you have a
Yeah, I
question,
think we
Michael?
have time for one more. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Well, this may be a bit of a comment. In the painting of the model on the platform, I had a sense that the model was so comfortable in that space, and that almost she seemed to be the master or the mistress of that space. There was this kind of a sense of control of that. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into it.
No, I don't think so. Actually, I think what Doris is making everything revolve around this woman who is doing work, right? And it's this woman who walks the streets and who is the source for the grand nude, right? I mean, the grand nude is just a made-up thing, but it comes from this woman who's doing a work, who's doing a job, and that is her office, right? I mean, she's familiar with it. She is in control. Everyone's staring at her, right? And trying to work. She's the model. She's the one who's the master of what she's doing, and everyone else is trying to figure it out. So, yeah, I think all of those things are intentional. Absolutely. Yeah.
So we'll do
And
one more question.
Wait, one second. I just also, you can go to the next person, but I just also want to say that look at the women up there that are in the, the theme that Melissa pulled out as women's work. I mean, look at Siesta. It's from the 40s, but look at her, yeah, and from the 40s, and these, they're the focus. I love Bather with Hoop. That's one of my favorite. She's this woman that dominates the canvas in these really simple forms. Yeah.
You had people that were contemporaries of hers up there, but what artists do you think were influenced by her, and did anyone specifically say it? I think of one artist, his last name is Boetti, and he puts all those little figures together into an abstract, and it looked like her beach scene. And it was coincidental, and he is after her. So I wondered if anyone had ever looked at how she influenced others.
So first of all, I think she was very influential in the 40s and 50s with works like this, because I think it was recognized that she was drawing on so many things that were swirling around the art world then, about the primacy of folk artists, this immediate expression, and they're untrained and they're just, getting it out there. I think that was that was, you know, something that people recognized in her work. She's certainly getting awards right, left, and center. I think the later work, you know, moves into the group of artists, you know, not just Avery and Michael, but, you know, that color, the interest in that color. And, you know, I don't want to say that, well, I think she did meet Rothko, right? Didn't they? Yeah. I mean, you know, she was always figurative. So certainly by the late 40s and 50s, she wasn't one of those serious painters, right? But she was very well known. I'm trying to think if there's anything direct. Now, I do know that her commercial work was very influential. Her illustration work and her design work was very influential. It was, you know, I'm going to show my, Barbara, you probably know this. It was like a primitive school of illustration, you know, that simplified things in the way in which she did with the lines, and it was sort of like a new way of illustrating.
But it was that. I mean, that was what the advertisers were interested in too. I mean, well, think about how that reproduces in print. You know, that style is really important for reproduction in those days. And we were just talking about this too. That sort of fell out of favor when photography became more used in advertising and reproduction. It was much easier to do it that way. But that's, you know, I mean, her gouache style, her, you know, painting that, you know, almost as her records of her travels. That's how she painted when she traveled around the world for Life magazine, and painted, you know, in Africa and Mexico and Cuba and all of those places that she went for Life. So yeah, it's, but I can't think of an artist who came out and said, oh, Doris was my inspiration, you know, but there were lots of artists that were working in that similar style.
Yeah, I think Will Barnett and
Yeah, Will Barnett.
Especially, I got to see Hockney at the Royal Academy when he did those trees, and it really.
Well, you think, and thinking about Robert Gwathmey too. I mean, I think about, you know, and these are all artists that were working in New York, and they were, you know, this was not a, you know, it was New York City, but these artists sort of, you know, had this camaraderie and this, you know, they hung together just like the abstract expressionists did.
And actually, it was a group around the Art Students League, which is
Yeah.
interesting that we just showed that. So I was trying to think of Barnett, and I just couldn't. It's funny because I love Will Barnett. I talked to him one time on the phone, and he had this most incredible voice. I was like, oh. I mean, it was just like this resonant, like, you know, just very generous sort of. I was like, but Will Barnett. So I think there was a whole group of artists who were working in this sort of flattened but weren't giving up figuration, and they were mostly teaching and working around the Art Students League. And they did have a community. I mean, they were doing perfectly well. Were they the sort of rock stars that the New York School became? Because, you know, the New York School didn't become that until later, right? I mean, we sort of go, oh, they were big, and we push their reputations back in terms of years before it was actually formed. So it really, what is it? Pollock sells his, no, the Met finally buys a Pollock in 53, I think. Yeah, it's not until 53. And I think Barnett Newman doesn't sell anything until 57, something like that. It's in the 50s. So I think we often push their success earlier just because that's what we think of as, you know, mid-century painting. But it wasn't like that. So that group around the Art Students League was really strong and well-known and well-respected. But they did struggle with this, you know, with the fact that they were figurative, and that wasn't serious. That wasn't Jungian, and, you know, getting rid of narratives so that art could be pure and could express what it wants to express. And you know, that's not all of the New York School artists actually believe that themselves, but that's sort of the way it got carried. And so she does sort of, you know, I mean, Barbara and I were talking about this. So commercial art changes in the 60s, right? I mean, it becomes more based on photography and film, and just the way ads structure, the way that people believe things changes, right? and painting changes. You know, I think actually, you know, she had very early Alzheimer's onset. I think if that wouldn't have happened, her work would have come back. Because think of the colorists and even Alex Katz or even Will Barnett, you know, into the late 60s and 70s, that comes back. So you know, it sort of goes down, but she always had New York representation. I mean, you know, Barnett did too, you know, yeah.
And this is going to close this, but just think about the abstract expressionists, that most of them began as figurative painters. So, you know, they moved into their own style, and, you know, because they were together as this large group, you know, in the late 40s, they got all the attention, you know, the Irascibles, right? All of those, you know, that were pictured on the cover of Look or Life or whichever magazine that was. But, you know, they got all the attention, and that's what happened. And all of these figurative artists like Doris, the American scene artists, they were sort of usurped by this group in this school. But they did begin that way, and then there was this other group of figurative artists that Museum of Modern Art picked up, and so Larry Rivers and Jim Dine and, you know, those artists, Tom Wesselman, I mean, they all sort of came in, and then all of a sudden, you know, we had this sort of, you know, pop art, op art, this sort of continuum that went, so.
Well, thank you so much. Let's give Melissa and Barbara a round of applause.
Yeah, it was fun.
Thank you both so much for an excellent program and an amazing exhibition. So thank you all for being here. We have a few upcoming events. Our American Dream Dinner that goes with the exhibition is November 6th. We have our Community Day on November 7th, and then on November 12th and 13th, we have our Holiday Mart. So some great things coming up. So thanks again for being here. Have a wonderful evening.